Well, good morning, Westside. Well, I haven't met you yet. My name is Michael, and I'm the groups guy here at Westside. I'm really excited to be with you this morning. Hey, I want to start with a question. I want to ask you, do you remember the first time you really wanted something? Maybe you were a kid and it was that bicycle that the neighbor had, or it was that new toy, but do you remember the first time that you really, really wanted something? It's actually a really easy answer for me. I remember being in first grade and going over to my friend's house to play his Nintendo 64 gaming system. And it was awesome. Like, it was so cool. I played it and I thought the future is here. Like, this is such a cool and fun gaming system. And it was about 3 years until we got one in the Swearingen household. Once there were new things out and the price dropped on the old 64s, we got to get one. And we loved playing that Nintendo 64. If you were into Nintendo 64, we played games like Star Fox and Madden and Star Wars Pod Racing. And it was so much fun. We spent way too many hours playing on that gaming system. And it was really cool until I went to my friend Alex's house, and Alex had a PlayStation 2. And that was the new coolest thing. And not just that, but he introduced me to the coolest video game ever made, NCAA football. They don't make it anymore. It's my all-time favorite game, really cool. And all of a sudden, my Nintendo 64 wasn't so cool. Well, a few years later, we actually got the PlayStation 2, and the first game we went out and bought was NCAA football. And the thing about NCAA football is that every year they come out with a new game. Like, there's a new set of rosters, there's new features, and so every year you have to go get the new game. And so my brother and I, we'd save up money, and we would go as soon as it was released and buy the new NCAA football game every year. And this is totally a marketing strategy where there's always something new. There's always that next thing to go buy. There's actually a term for this in the marketplace. It's called planned obsolescence. And what that means is they are planning for things to become obsolete. They want you to buy the new thing before you need the new thing. And what this is, and what I was falling victim to, is the myth of more. The myth that that next thing would make me happy. The myth that I needed that new game to be happy. And the myth of more, the problem with it is it's something that invades all areas of our life. And today we're going to talk about King Solomon. And King Solomon started out as a really great king, but as his ego grows and as his kingdom does, he starts to buy into this myth of more, and he starts to make compromises. And the end of his story reads almost like a tragedy. Well, let's not waste any time. Let's jump right into King Solomon's story. King Solomon's story starts right at the end of his father David's story. And so David is on his deathbed, and David declares that Solomon will be the next king, and he encourages Solomon to continue following in the ways of God, to continue following the Lord as he leads the people of Israel. And that is what Solomon does as he starts out, and God appears to Solomon in a dream as he's getting ready to lead the people of Israel. And God says to Solomon, "Solomon, you can have anything you want. What would you like?" And Solomon answers that he would like wisdom. He wants to be wise. He wants to lead his people the way his father led his people. And God is pleased by this answer. God is actually so pleased by this answer that he says, "I not only will give you wisdom and make you the wisest man ever to have lived, but I will also give you wealth and power and the things you didn't ask for because you first humbled yourself." And Solomon pretty quickly gets to demonstrate this wisdom when two women come to him to settle a dispute. See, there were these two mothers, and one mother had rolled over on her child while she was sleeping, and the child had died. And so before the other mother woke up, she switched out the babies, and they are coming to Solomon for Solomon to settle this dispute, to tell them whose baby this actually is. And so what Solomon does is he has them take the baby, and he says, "All right, just cut the baby in half, and we'll give half to each mom." Sounds fair, right? You guys, this can be interactive. You can respond a little bit. Ooh, help me out, guys. So he says, that's fair, right? And obviously the mom whose child this was says, no, I would rather let the other mom have it. I would rather he live than die. And Solomon said, yes, that's the mother. The mother that would rather her child live is obviously the real mother. And the people of Israel are amazed at Solomon's wisdom. And he rules really well. He has incredible success. And I really wish the story just ended here. And we could put a nice bow on it. And Solomon was this great leader. And there was peace during the time of Solomon. And he was wise. But the problem is, as Solomon's kingdom begins to grow, as he begins to chase more and more, he starts to compromise. And he starts this slow descent. And what we learn from Solomon, is that as he's chasing more, he starts to do things that aren't so pleasing in God's sight. And the Bible brilliantly writes this out. It doesn't just come out and say that what Solomon does is wrong. It slowly shows us what he does and lets us see what the consequences or the result of that action is. And so Solomon, the next thing we read about him is that he starts to build the temple. And that's a really great thing because he was the one to build the temple, and so that pleased the Lord. But then we also read that he took a wife from Egypt, which isn't necessarily evil. Nothing about that is bad, but it should raise a red flag because if you remember the story of the Israelites, they were enslaved by the people of Egypt. And it's not long after we learn that he's taken a wife from Egypt that we learn that he starts conscripting slaves from his own people to build his kingdom. And that is something that was clearly against God's law for him to take slaves of his own people. And so we're starting to see some red flags come up. And then we get a lot of details of the story about how he built the temple and how immaculate the temple was and how great and how it pleased the Lord. And we get all this specifics of the types of wood they use and all these things. But then we get this really interesting line where it says that it took him 7 years to build the temple. And that's great because that seems like a long time. Like they put a lot of work into it if they took 7 years to build the temple. But the very next line says it took 13 years for Solomon to construct his own palace. So 7 years to build the temple, and then 13 years for Solomon to build his own palace. And there's something just a little bit off. And as we read his story, there's like not major things as we read this part. There's just little departures that we start to see, little compromises that are being made. Shortly after that, God appears to Solomon and warns him to stay faithful to him and not be corrupted by the surrounding nations, and Solomon seems to agree. And then we get a list of Solomon's incredible accomplishments. And listen to some of the things that Solomon does. We read about how he built incredible cities. We read about how well the palace ate. We read about the incredible amount of wealth that he acquired. We read specifically how many chariots that he owned. We also read, and this is important later, but we read that he has his horses imported from Egypt and that they were the finest horses. We read about all of these great accomplishments of Saul. But then we also read that Solomon took 900 wives, which I think we can all agree is just too many. And so Solomon takes 900 wives, and the Bible isn't like, this one, it doesn't even play with. It says, and they started to slowly corrupt him. And what they did was they started to bring their idols into Israel. And so for the first time under Solomon's reign, idol worship is allowed in the nation of Israel. And this is obviously not good, and we're watching this downward spiral of Solomon. And so if you remember back, Solomon is the third king to reign over Israel. Before him was his dad, David, who was a man after God's own heart, but as TJ shared with us, he fell just short and he still messed up. And before that, if you remember, Eddie taught about King Saul, who looked the part but didn't have the heart, was the great line that Eddie used to describe Saul. And before that, if you remember, God's people were ruled by God through his prophets, and that is the best king, to have God as your king. And so he warns them that you don't want a king. Your king will make you look like all the other nations, but the Israelites persist and they ask for a king. And it only takes 3 kings for us to get to Solomon, and Solomon is the last king to rule over a united Israel. After this, Israel divides, and all the kings afterwards rule over a divided Israel. It only takes 3 kings for the king position to become so corrupted. Well, before they had a king, God knew they would want a king. So in Deuteronomy, when he's giving them the law, he gives them specific law. He says, if you must have a king, here is what I want the king to do. Here's some laws that the king needs to follow. And so we've talked a little bit about Solomon. I'm going to read you these laws, and I want you to think about how Solomon's doing. Kind of give Solomon a grade in your head, how he's doing following these laws from Deuteronomy. So what Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14 says. You are about to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you. When you take it over and settle there, you may think, we should select a king to rule over us like the other nations around us. If this happens, be sure to select as a king the man the Lord your God chooses. You must appoint a fellow Israelite. He may not be a foreigner. The king must not build up large stables of horses for himself or send his people to Egypt to buy horses. Do you remember where Solomon's horses were from? Later on, he says, you must never return to Egypt. Do you remember where Solomon's first wife was from? The king must not take many wives for himself because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth and silver and gold for himself. So Solomon breaks almost every single one of these commandments. And Solomon is the wisest man ever to live. He would have known the law. He would have known these commandments. And over time, as his wealth grows, he shows us just how hard it really is to manage wealth. And he shows us that he starts to buy into that myth of more. As he chases a bigger kingdom, as he chases that next thing, he starts to buy into that same myth of more that we were talking about earlier. And he is slowly corrupted. And we read the story of Solomon that starts off so well, and it ends up at the end reading almost like a tragedy. Well, we have the book of Ecclesiastes, and we believe that Solomon is the teacher writing in this book. And here is what Solomon, as an old man reflecting back on his life, writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Verse 9, he says this, So I became greater than all who had lived in Jerusalem before me, and my wisdom never failed me. Anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure. I even found great pleasure in hard work, a reward for all my labors. But as I looked at everything I worked so hard to accomplish, it was all so meaningless, like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5, he says this, Those who love money will never have enough. How meaningless to think that wealth brings true happiness. The more you have, the more people come to help you spend it. So what good is wealth, except perhaps to watch it slip through your fingers? The philosopher, the notorious B.I.G., put it this way, more money, more problems. And so, that's what gets the clap? All right. Good morning to you. So Solomon is telling us, he is shouting from the book of Ecclesiastes to learn from his example, to not pursue wealth, to not pursue these things. He says, I denied myself nothing, and it all ended up like chasing the wind. When we look at Solomon from an earthly standpoint, he is maybe the most successful person ever to live. There was peace in Israel during his rule. There was incredible wealth. But he gets to the end and he writes us this warning that it's all meaningless. And that is something we have got to pay attention to. Rockefeller, when he was the wealthiest man in America, was asked, how much money is enough money? To which he responded, just a little bit more. And that is that myth of more, of just getting that next accomplishment, just getting that next paycheck, that next toy, that next thing that's going to bring happiness to all of us. And what Solomon is telling us here is that more will never be enough. It is like chasing the wind. But the warning Solomon is giving us here is that he spent an entire life chasing after more. And what he learned the hard way is what Jesus teaches us later, that wherever our treasure is, there our heart will also be. And why this should be such a warning to us is we live in a culture of more. We live in a culture that sells that same lie, the myth of more that Solomon buys into, that sells that incredibly well. After World War I, corporations were afraid of overproducing things, and so they actually brought back propaganda tactics that they had learned in Europe. They brought those back to America, and that is the birthplace of modern marketing. And you can read all sorts of really interesting reads about this, but I'd love to just share you this quote from Paul Muser of Lehman Brothers. He said this around that time: "We must shift America from a needs culture to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old has been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality. Man's desire must overshadow his needs." And that is what we referred to earlier, the common marketplace practice called planned obsolescence, where they are planning for us to need something new before we actually need it. Hence why I want a new iPhone every single year. Hence why my car is great until I see the new model pull up beside me. That is what we're being marketed. We're being sold the good life. We're being sold that more will make us happy. I don't know if you know this, but the number one leisure activity in America today is shopping. Another interesting stat from my research this week: did you know that the average American home, as far as square footage, is double the size it was just 50 years ago, but the average American family is half the size it was 50 years ago? And so we're buying more house for less people than we were just 50 years ago. And we're being sold this concept of the good life. And marketers have gotten so good at selling us like you've never turned on the Ford commercial and the person in the seat looks stressed like he's trying to get to the next meeting. No, they're selling us this good life. And what they've gotten so good at doing is selling us the same myth of more that Solomon bought into. And so we've got to pay attention to this. And the problem with the myth of more is it doesn't just affect the things we own or our money. It is something that creeps into every area of our life. It creeps into our relationships. It creeps into our marriages. Tim Keller writes a really great book on marriage and relationships, period, called The Meaning of Marriage. And one of the things he talks about in that book, he spends a lot of time in the first chapter unpacking how our relationships have become consumer-driven. In the Bible teaches covenantal relationships, those relationships that say, no matter what, I'm going to stick it out. Our society teaches that as long as you're getting an acceptable amount compared to what you're putting in, that's how we should do relationships. And I'd love to read you this really short excerpt out of Tim Keller's book, The Meaning of Marriage, that I think is just so helpful. Sociologists argue that in contemporary Western society, the marketplace, so that same marketplace that we were just talking about, has become so dominant that the consumer model increasingly characterizes most relationships that were historically covenantal, including marriage. Today, we stay connected to people only as long as they are meeting our particular needs at an acceptable cost to us. When we cease to make a profit, that is, when the relationship appears to require more love and affirmation from us than we are getting back, then we cut our losses and drop the relationship. This has also been called commodification, a process by which social relationships are reduced to economic exchange relationships. And so the very idea of covenant is disappearing in our culture. And that's why the myth of more is such a cancer that we need to be concerned about. Solomon had everything he could possibly want, but he still ends up taking 900 wives for himself, going after relationship after relationship. He gets wealth and he builds his kingdom, and it ends with him in Ecclesiastes saying, this is all meaningless. So what are we to do? What are the people of Jesus to do if Solomon, the wisest man ever to live, fell victim to this? What hope do we have? Well, the great thing is Jesus actually talked a lot about this. Actually, about 25% of Jesus' teachings are on this very topic because he knew it would be something that we struggle with. And so I'd love to turn straight to the words of Jesus in Luke chapter 12 and learn from Jesus. In this chapter, Jesus is approached by two brothers. And these brothers want help settling their father's estate, who should get what inheritance. And Jesus responds to them and basically says that life doesn't exist, in an abundance of possessions. And he tells them this parable about a farmer that stored up way too many crops that he could ever use. And God came to him that night and said, "You fool, you will die tonight." And so Jesus tells that story as a warning about storing up earthly treasures. And then he turns to his disciples and says this. He turns to his disciples because he needs them to get this concept. These are the guys that are going to go lead the early church. And so he needs them to understand this concept. And this is what he says in verse 22. Then turning to his disciples, Jesus said, "That is why I tell you not to worry about everyday life, whether you have enough food to eat or enough clothes to wear. For life is more than food, and your body more than clothing. Look at the ravens. They don't plant or harvest or store food in barns, for God feeds them. And you are far more valuable than any birds. Can all your worries add a single moment to your life?" And that could also be translated, add a foot to your height. And Jesus here is saying, you can't add a foot to your height. You have no control over that. And if worry can't accomplish a little thing like that, what's the use of worrying over bigger things? Look at the lilies and how they grow. They don't work or make their clothing. Look who he compares the beautiful lilies to here. He says, "Yet Solomon in all his glory was not dressed as beautifully as they are. And if God cares so wonderfully for the flowers that are here today and thrown into the fire tomorrow, he will certainly care for you. Why do you have so little faith?" I just want to pause there really quick. Isn't it so interesting how Jesus talks about worry and money like almost interchangeably? Like they are so attached in his teachings. Like worry and money are so tightly associated. That's just a quick note. I want to keep reading this passage. "And don't be concerned about what to eat and what to drink. Don't worry about such things. These things dominate the thoughts of unbelievers all over the world. But your Father already knows your needs. Seek the kingdom of God above all else, and he will give you everything you need. So don't be afraid, little flock, for it gives your Father great happiness to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to those in need. This will store up treasures for you in heaven, and the purses of heaven will never get old or develop holes. Your treasure will be safe. No thief can steal it, no moth can destroy it." I love this last line. "Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be." I want us to pause real quick and look at three things that Jesus is teaching us. Three ways that we combat the myth of more. And the first is this, and it was the thing I pointed out a second ago, is Jesus associates worry and possessions like they're almost interchangeably. There's a very tight association there. And what we learn from that is that everything we own, every possession we own, comes with some level of anxiety. Every square foot of our house is a square foot that's going to need cleaned. It's a square foot that's going to need updated at some point. Every device we own is going to go bad at some point. It's going to need repaired. Every single thing we own comes with some level of anxiety. I'd love to illustrate it this way. In our little house that we live in, we have this small closet, and it's perfectly sized to fit a small stackable washer and dryer in. And so as we were moving in, we started shopping all over Facebook Marketplace to find a washer and dryer that we can afford and to put it in this little closet. It had to be a very specific size, and so we finally found a washer and dryer that was nice and could fit in our little closet and looked like it would work well. And it was great, and it was such a blessing we got it. And a washer and dryer, they're really great. Like they actually save a lot of time. Like I don't know what they did before washers and dryers, like how clothes got clean, but it's pretty incredible that I just throw my clothes in this and like a couple hours later my clothes are clean. Like that's pretty incredible. It actually adds time back to my day. It saves me time. It's really great. That is until one day when we were about to go on vacation and we were doing that thing you do before you go on vacation where you put all your clothes in the washer and you wash them all so you can pack. And our washer broke in the middle of that load. And all of a sudden, we're supposed to leave town tomorrow, and this washer is broken. And so I did what any guy would do. I hopped on Google, watched a guy fix it, and thought, I could do that. And so I ordered a part, and it was going to get here while we were gone. And so I was like, let's just take our clothes, cut our losses, go to the laundromat. We'll deal with this when we get home. And it ended up not being a big deal. It was really easy to switch out a part when we got home. But that entire trip, I had that in the back of my head. This entire week that me and my wife were away when we should have been relaxing and not thinking about a washer and dryer back at home, it was in the back of my head. To the point where as we're going out to eat and I'm thinking, should we eat somewhere cheaper in case I need to buy a new washer and dryer when I get home? Should we maybe not do this excursion we had planned on doing because I may need to buy or hire someone to come fix my washer and dryer when I get home? It just like sat, as much as I tried not to think about it, it just sat in the back of my head the entire trip. And it's just such a good reminder that even something like a washer and dryer that saves us time can still cause so much anxiety, and every single thing we own causes some level of anxiety. And the truth behind that is if we will realize that, it is so opposite of the myth of more. The myth of more tells us that these things are going to bring happiness, that these things are going to make our life easier, that if we'll just get this new thing, we won't even know what to do with all the free time that we have now, which is never the case. But the realization that everything we own brings some level of anxiety brings a truth to that these things that we're buying aren't going to bring happiness. These things that we're buying aren't going to fix all of our problems. And it's so important to remember. And that's why Jesus ties worry and possessions so closely. Every time he talks about possessions and worry, they're so closely associated. Second thing is this. Jesus' followers practice simplicity. Simplicity is an age-old spiritual discipline that Christians have been following for a long time. I love how Adele Calhoun, in her book, Spiritual Disciplines, describes simplicity. She says this: simplicity cultivates the great art of letting go. Jesus said this: life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And so if our culture has shifted from a needs culture to a desires culture, we, the people of Jesus, have to do something to start to shift back. We have to take action. We have to practice what's called simplicity. Simplicity is basically us getting rid of the things we don't need and living with just what we need. And simplicity is also very different from organizing. Sometimes we confuse organizing and simplicity. Organizing is figuring out how I keep everything that I have. Like, if I'm organizing my closet, maybe I get rid of like one or two things, but for the most part, I'm trying to fit everything in my closet. Or if I'm organizing my calendar, I'm trying to see how I can fit all these different things in my calendar, where simplicity is the opposite of that. Simplicity is saying, I have a lot in here that I don't need. I have excess. I have things that I can cut from my budget. I have things that I can cut from my calendar to make room for the things that really matter. And what's great about this is something that's really easy to practice and starting small, starting to put into practice. This could be as simple as you going home today and taking a garbage bag, or maybe 10, and just filling it up with stuff that I haven't used in a year, and donating that to Goodwill or donating that to someone, and just starting to say, I can live with less. I don't need more. I don't need to be sold this myth of more. I can live with that less. And maybe this is your calendar. You just need to hit reset on your calendar and fill it with some things that really matter. Fill it with time with Jesus. Fill it with time for community. Fill it with some things that really matter. Because the thing about simplicity is it's an outward expression, but it's an outward expression of something that's happening inwardly with our heart. And the thing with this is that our heart is at stake with all of this. When we talk about the myth of more, our heart is at stake. And we look at Solomon and his example and how he slowly started to be corrupted as he pursued more and more. That has got to be a warning for us that our heart is at stake in all of this. I love Solomon. In Proverbs chapter 11, he wrote this: trust in money and down you go. But I love how direct that is. But the godly will flourish like leaves in the spring. And Jesus said, and we've already read this verse once, but wherever your treasure is, there your heart will also be. And so our heart is at stake in all of this. And Jesus is warning us that the myth of more is just that it's a myth. That as we chase more, as we chase that next thing, as we chase that promotion that's going to bring happiness, as we chase that new relationship, that it leads to burnout, that it leads to exhaustion, that it leads to worry, that it leads to anxiety. And Jesus offers us a different way. It is so opposite of what we are being sold by our culture, but his way is easy and his burden is light. And that is the promise that he gives us. And so when we start to compromise It happens slowly, but when we chase the myth, the more we always start to compromise. And it may not be in major ways that anyone sees, but we start to compromise our calendars and our schedules, and before we know it, we are just so busy, we don't have margin for anything. We start to compromise our budget, and before we realize, maybe we really want to be generous. When we see someone in need, we want to be a generous follower of Christ that can help meet that need, but our budget is just so tight that we don't have the margin to do that. And so we start to compromise, and anything that distracts us from what matters most is ways that we compromise. I can't tell you how many times, being the groups guy, that I hear from people who are desperate to get into community. They want to hop into the next round of Rooted. They want to hop into a small group. They want to hop into something that we're doing, but they just can't make it work on their schedule. And I wonder if we've just got it so backwards that we're filling our schedules up with so many of the wrong things, that the things that our heart is desperate for, we're not actually creating room for and margin for. And so I want to close with this concept. Say I was to say to you, I'm going to run a marathon in a month. I'm going to train and run a marathon. You would probably look at me and say, you're going to need to train for that. You are not in shape to run a marathon. And you would be absolutely correct. I am nowhere close in shape to run a marathon. Well, say I tell you that, I make a big deal about it, and next week you catch me out just sitting in the concourse, and I've got a Big Mac in this hand, and I've got a big gulp in this hand, and my feet are up on the table, and you come by me and you say, how's that marathon training going? And I'm like, it's so busy. Life is crazy right now. I'm going to start that next week. If you were bold, you would say this to my face, but probably say this in the back of your head. I don't think that guy's going to run a marathon. Like, I don't think he's serious. He knows the kind of change it takes to run a marathon. And change always requires action. I love this quote, that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And we see the end results of the myth of more. The end results are Solomon looking back on his highly successful life and saying, it's all meaningless. It's all like chasing after the wind. And so if we want to end up somewhere different, and the results we're getting right now are tired, and we're worried, and we're anxious, and we keep chasing after this myth of more, and whatever that is in your life, then we've got to do something to change. We've got to do something. Simplicity is that outward action, but showing what's happening inwardly. And so we can all do something. And so I don't know what it is for you today, but whether you need to go home like we talked about and fill up some trash bags. Maybe you need to simplify your wardrobe and just go through things and say, you know what? There's a lot of things in here that I haven't worn in years, and I can donate that to someone who really needs it. And maybe you need to press pause on a purchase you're considering and just think, is this something that I actually need? Or maybe as I've been talking, you're like, I just bought something that I really don't need, and I probably should return it. I'm not trying to guilt you and tell you you should do that. If God's telling you should do that, that's another thing. But I'm not trying to guilt you this morning and say that. Maybe you need to go through your budget and just go through line by line and say, is there anything that if I eliminate from here, I could experiment for a couple months and say, would I even miss it? We've had the same conversation with two different couples at Westside post Fearless, where we had cut something out of our budget. And after 2 years of it being cut out of our budget for Fearless, so we could give the most generous gift we could over 2 years, looking back, we realized, man, we don't even miss it. And we have no desire to go back. We love how our budget's been simplified and the margin that has given us, and we do not miss those things we've cut out. So maybe you need to experiment with that and see if there's just something in your budget that you can cut. Or maybe you need to hit reset on your calendar and fill it with some things that matter. Fill it with time with God. Fill it with time with your family. Fill it with things that are going to bring life to you that aren't chasing this myth of more. Because here's the deal. Like I said a second ago, chasing this myth that leads to anxiety and worry, it leads to burnout, and it leads at the very end to a life where Solomon looks at his life and says it was all meaningless. And I don't want that for anyone in this room. The way of Jesus is so countercultural. Living simply is not the way of our culture, and so it looks a little bit weird, it looks hard, but it leads to freedom. And the way of Jesus, as different as it might sound, is easy, and he says his yoke is light. And so I'd love to finish this way. We're going to respond in song in a second, but I just wanted to read an invitation straight from Jesus. Read you this invitation of Jesus inviting you to follow his way, to put down those pursuits that are exhausting, to put down chasing more, and to follow his way. And so I just want you to receive this, hear these words straight from Jesus, and then we'll respond in song. Matthew 11, verse 28 says this, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light."